I'm going to begin. Is it the microphone somewhere? Is it this? I was trying to get it to work. If it works, that would be really helpful because my voice is failing me. I told in an earlier class I sound like Barry White, and that meant absolutely nothing to them. Does anyone know who Barry White is? No. Okay. Well, not okay. I, well, anyway, I'll do anything for a cheap laugh. So here we go. This is Barry White, so we look similar, and this is the sound. Oh, stop it. See? All right, that was not funny. There you go. That's it. Yeah, yeah. Okay, enough. No, I am not going to sing it. I don't get paid enough for that. Really? Hello? No. Oh, sorry. I saw the wrong one. Really? Oh, it works. Oh. Okay, so thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, I'll try not to strain my voice so that people in the back row can hear me. And very good. Thank you. So hopefully this will mean that I can get through the class because I'm going to start with Ulysses. We're looking at Alfred Lord Tennyson today. And with him moving from the Romantic period, we finished last time with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and then in the class that I had to do online for health reasons, which you can hear part of now, we looked at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the Victorian era. The 19th century, when it comes to English literature, is divided into strange periodizations. When you study English, it's often 16th century literature and 17th and 18th. But when you get to the 19th, it starts to become very complicated, and it begins with the Romantic period and the Victorian era, and then maybe the Edwardian period. So three different phases, if you will, all of which I think are influenced by the Romantic period. But the Victorian era is marked by the great queen of Great Britain at the time, Queen Victoria, who lives all the way through the century, pretty much from 1832 onwards, she reigns. And the reign is concurrent with the advance of Britain to be a global empire. So industrialization has happened, and the British Navy brings British ideas and British culture to a global audience, literally, because of the advance of the British Empire. So most of Britain, and I'll say more about this when we come to Heart of Darkness, the representation of Britain on the global stage, but pretty much it's this. If you looked at a map in that period, you would see the colors of the United Kingdom in every continent. South America, Africa, Asia, North America, obviously, and obviously Europe itself. And so that such that the sun really never sets on the British Empire. And one of the consequences of that is, for a little island off the coast of Europe that is an inconsequential power historically speaking, even in Europe, it gains a global political significance that far outstrips any of its historic consciousness, and it feels the weight of the burden of the empire on its shoulders. I'm now anthropomorphizing, calling the nation as if it were a man and bearing weight, but it's it's a very different thing from being a small little island fighting the European powers in first Queen Elizabeth's day, a Protestant kingdom fighting against the Catholic powers of Europe with a language that is not much understood on the continent, to being one of the two great powers of the 19th century along with France. But that's where Britain finds itself. And so it really is difficult in the midst of all that for people to really grasp or understand how to understand what is happening that has brought Britain to this preeminence. And it happens under Queen Victoria's reign, by and large. And so one of the things that the poets do is they look in the long history of English mythology for some sort of sign that this would happen. And they don't see any sign per se. But what they do find, and this is characteristic of this period, is in the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which we've looked at already last semester when we looked at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We find a precedent for a kingdom of perfection in some ways, of a golden age, with knights committed to a life of virtue and to expelling the work of darkness from the kingdom of King Arthur and dedicated to chivalric ideals. And those become very, very popular in the 19th century. So the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table undergoes a resurgence of interest in the 19th century. You don't really find it in the 16th, the 17th, the 18th centuries, and not even in the early 19th century, but in the mid-19th century, in the midst of the Victorian era, in the midst of the growth of the global empire, there's a sudden fascination with King Arthur and the idea of returning to a golden age, because now Britain really is in a golden era. And it reaches back to the story of King Arthur to help understand itself. And I think the popularity of King Arthur and his knights has not entirely gone. There's a lot of movies that are brought out to this day and popular TV series that are dedicated to Camelot and those knights and the battles fought and the significance of this and so forth. And even Americans understand themselves in the same mythic tradition. So the Democrat President John F. Kennedy and his presidential stable, as it were, they call themselves Camelot. And the ideas were a young, virtuous king, or in the case of Kennedy, president, who promised better things in the midst of a resurgence of American power on the global stage, etc. So again, this, in the English people's consciousness, the importance of Arthur as a figure is picked up very much by Tennyson. The second poem we look at, The Lady of Shalott, will focus on that. I want to go to the first poem I want to look at, however, is Ulysses, because it is a great poem in itself, and it's shorter, and it brings into our vista here a figure we've studied from the beginning of this semester, actually last semester, namely the figure of Odysseus. So Ulysses is the Latin name for the Greek figure of Odysseus. Virgil called him Ulysses, and so did, for that matter, Dante. Same figure. And Ulysses becomes a famous novel by James Joyce, the great Irish writer as well, which is a novel, again, about an epic figure, and the figure is none other than Odysseus. So, as I said at the beginning of the whole back in September, the material that we cover here is not just material that I find interesting, it's been found perennially interesting by people who have read for millennia. And it continues to exert an influence and a significance that people find when reading it, even though they know the story already in many cases. It doesn't matter, it's how it's told and what it means that create such interest. But here, when Tennyson writes this, there's a twofold feature of Tennyson's writing that I want to mention to you. One is the sense of greatness that comes with Britain being a global power, and the need to accept it and to live as chivalrous as one can possibly do. And so the ideal is the Victorian gentleman that we saw last time in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that Stevenson critiqued. It showed the hypocrisy of the Victorian gentleman in many ways. So he's got the top hat and the tails and the stiff upper lip, and he goes through life and he has a sort of image and veneer of respectability, but when the doors are closed, he's doing things that probably ought not to be done. So it's a picture of hypocrisy in many ways. That's Stevenson's take on it. Here, it's presented a little differently by Tennyson, who, by the way, is poet laureate after William Wordsworth, who we looked at a few classes ago, was named so by Queen Victoria herself. And Tennyson is interested in the greatness of the age in which he lives and the greatness that's been almost thrust upon Britain, and the responsibility that comes with that at the very time when he and most of the people in Victorian England are losing their faith in God. Because in the mid-19th century, Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin is published, and various other works from the higher critical school of biblical study are questioning the life of Jesus and whether the Gospels actually give us an accurate historical representation of the life of Jesus, or whether it's been something that's been made up by the disciples for their own purposes. And so there's the quest for the historical Jesus, which you probably have heard about in your theology classes, I assume. I don't know. Yes. And many people, and Tennyson is among them, struggles to hold on to the faith that's been given to him by his ancestors. He struggles with extreme doubt. And at the same time, he recognizes that without that historic Christian faith, which held everything together, that it will be impossible for Britain to hold on to a global empire. So there's a sense of tragedy and the spirit of a culture with enormous strength in terms of resources and peoples and now military, and a sense of being pushed to this position of prominence on a global stage at the very time when they lack the virtue to hold on to it. So that twin sense of not being ready for the greatness into which they've been thrust is there, and yet the need to do one's best and hold on to that. So Ulysses reflects that, and Ulysses, or Odysseus, as you know, in the Odyssey, we concluded with Odysseus having defeated all of the suitors, slaughtered them all, and with the families of the suitors wanting vengeance on Odysseus, and Athena coming along and the other gods intervening and breaking apart the very messy conclusion that it would have come to if the suitors had avenged themselves on Odysseus. They preserved Odysseus, everything was pacified, and we're told at the end of it that Ulysses or Odysseus's adventures would be over when he went overseas on his last voyage and planted an oar upright in the sand. Then his voyages would be over. And that's where this poem begins, with Odysseus at the end of the story of the Odyssey, as an old man with his battles behind him, having left a son and as his heir, and his inheritance secured with justice established at the height in the sense of Odysseus is familiar with his legacy secured, and yet he has one more voyage to go on. Just like Britain itself, it doesn't have the strength. It's lost. It's with age and with use. It's not what it used to be. But there's one last fight in it. So that sense of desperation and weakness and doom are all captured in this great poem. So it's called Ulysses. And I'll read it to you, and then we'll say a little bit more about it. So Ulysses. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. Remember, he's been 20 years away. Now he's back, and he's not liking it. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees, to the bottom. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone, on shore and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vexed the dim sea. I am become a name. For always roaming with a hungry heart, much have I seen and known. Cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life. Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence. Something more, a bringer of new things, and vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost point bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labor by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centered in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free hearts, free foreheads. You and I are old. Old age hath yet his honor and his toil. Death closes all. But something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. The slow moon climbs. The deep moans around with many voices. Come, my friends. 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So this is a magnificent poem. I tried to read it in a manner worthy of the poem itself. It's a terrific poem, because what you see captured in it is an old man who has spent his life pursuing glory overseas, and attaining it by coming home. Remember, the Odyssey is the story of a return homeward, and he secures his reputation in large part by conquering the enemy that has overcome his house as much as he'd fought the battles on the plains of Troy. But he does not like being a domestic ruler, and he longs for more glory. And that means going out and sailing abroad once again. And feels himself and his strength having waned in his old age, nonetheless believes it's better to go out on his shield than it is to die of old age on the golf course or whatever its equivalent is in the fields of Ithaca, sitting at home until he passes away, watching television, perhaps, whatever the equivalent is. And in Ulysses, I think we have something of the what I expressed as Tennyson's sense of Britain suddenly old, with a great reputation and a name, and the tribute that comes with its accomplishments in the early 19th century. And now there's an empire. Victoria is the Empress of India. Britain, for a time, rules over China and Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South America, Africa. There are countries all over the world of which Victoria is the queen. And yet, do the British people themselves have the strength to hold on to this vast duty that's been thrust upon them? He finds in Ulysses, I think, a figure that speaks to a sense of greatness that might fail and might not, however. There's that tension there. But what you see above all is this commitment to a sort of going down in a glorious fashion if they're going to fail, not for want of trying. As it says at the end, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. It's a fantastic conclusion. By the way, if you have has anyone heard this poem before? And you might have, if you've seen any of the Bond movies, because Judi Dench, when she was cited this passage in, I don't know which one, I think it's called Skyfall. If you've ever seen Skyfall, if you haven't, and watch it, she has, and so it's really interestingly done by the cinematographer there to have her quoting this, because her ex-husband, M's ex-husband, Judi Dench's, was a Tennyson lover, and so she cited it, said she didn't like it herself, but she recites it by heart, and what you have is a James Bond who's been weakened by age and time, and we've moved on. We don't need field agents, dinosaurs. We don't need individual men who represent greatness that we all depend on. We now have technology. And it has him running and chasing the bad guy down. It's really well done as footage with this particular poem. It represents something of the human spirit, I think Tennyson expresses here. Any comments or questions about this poem, which I think is great? Did you like it? So Tennyson writes this poem, and I'll look at the Lady of Shalott as well, he also writes something called Idylls of the King, which are stories of King Arthur and his court as well. And various others, Charge of the Light Brigade, all sorts of poems. Tennyson is a great, great, great poet. Too little read in our day. Should receive a lot more attention than he does. I think partly he has fallen out of fashion because he so much represents a Britain that the British now want to forget, because it's the Britain of empire. And we live in post-colonial times where people don't want to mention that time, even though it's the forging of the modern world in many ways. And ignoring it does nothing. At any rate, okay, so if that's the case, let me move on to the Lady of Shalott and see what I can do here. Lady of Shalott. Now this, let me say something about the Lady of Shalott. So this is another terrific poem, and it introduces one of the figures from the Round Table, one that we have not yet mentioned, although it's been ever so briefly mentioned. It was mentioned in Dante. It talked about Lancelot and Guinevere and the illicit relationship that resulted in the queen having an affair with the first knight of the empire, which brings down the whole of Camelot. So adultery breaks the golden kingdom in many ways. So an act of that, and it was read by Paolo and Francesca are reading this in Canto 5 of the Inferno. And Tennyson will focus on that story. If you want to read Idylls of the King, which I recommend, they're very good reading again, he deals with that story there as well. But here he is not interested in Lancelot and Guinevere. He's interested in Lancelot and a lady posited, called the Lady of Shalott, posited to exist in a tower. And one of the things that it raises us to question, because this is not a story which we read about in the legends of Mallory or any of the other Arthurian legends of the Middle Ages, is what does this Lady of Shalott represent? It seems, I'll say at the outset, allegorical. It seems to represent something more than just the relationship between Lancelot and a young woman in a tower. The other thing I will say, which I haven't mentioned thus far, I've talked a fair bit about the significance of King Arthur and so forth in the Victorian era, is the effect of an artistic movement, as in the movement of painters on Tennyson and vice versa. These painters are called the Pre-Raphaelites. Has anyone heard of the Pre-Raphaelites? Let me put a few up here. No, I gotta get this to one side. Society of Young Artists, and one writer, founded in 1848. Opposed to the Royal Academy's promotion of the ideal as exemplified in the work of Raphael. So here they are from the Tate Gallery itself. Here's some of them. So this is Ophelia from, I guess you can't see that. Can you even see that? You can't. Let me see if I can. Should have killed that off. Did that do it? I did it. There we go. That's much better. Still not great, but better. It's where she jumps in the water and then drowns, yeah. So this is just one. Oh, they don't have much here at all. That's terrible. Okay, won't bother with that then. They'll have it under images, however. So some of these are, this is the Lady of Shalott herself. Actually, you know what? I'll just do the Lady of Shalott, and I bet you it has it, not even as painting as the Wikipedia entry, I suspect, will have. Where's the Wikipedia? There it is. It will have it, all sorts of pictures, I bet. So there's one. Oh, come on. And this one, there's William Hunt. Yes, Holman Hunt, much better. Or this one, or Waterhouse. See the tapestry here? She's in the boat, and on the prow, the Lady of Shalott written. Where did I get that? There's a lot more. Oh, okay. Anyway, that's enough of that. But it's an artistic movement which depicts a certain ideal of art that has a pathos about it, and it involves certain female models that become, you start to see their faces repeatedly throughout the whole series of artists. It's a famous artistic movement anyway. This is not to give you an art history class, but but this one seemed to be one of the most important subjects for the painting. There are several renderings of the Lady of Shalott by various of the painters. And it's unfortunate I didn't set this up so that I could show you more of them in advance, but let's see if I can. Lady of Shalott, and there's the images, and I'll see a lot more. Oh, there's another one. That's the one I wanted. This one I particularly like. The reason I like this one is because it has the mirror. This is the mirror that she's looking at here. Or is the mirror over here? One way or the other. She looks at life in a mirror, and then she weaves on her loom what she sees in the mirror. So what we need to understand then is the Lady of Shalott never looks directly at life. She sees things through the mirror of something else. And what it's raising to the consciousness of the listener is, how do we look at life? Do we look at it directly, or do we look at it by means of something that represents it to us or imitates it? And if you recall, when we last semester looked at Plato's allegory of the cave, remember, some of you were with me for the allegory of the cave. This was Plato's critique of the artists, that they never portrayed things as they really are, but rather a representation of them. And the representation was not accurate. He was criticizing the way Homer and many of the other poets depicted the gods, because they depicted the god as jealous and petty and adulterous and lying and all these sorts of things. And Socrates said, plainly, they don't know what the gods are like if they're portraying them this way. It's impossible. And the poets know about as much about goodness and beauty and truth and justice as as the drunk on the street corner. They know nothing about justice if this is their portrait of it. So what we need are people who, in education, who understand what true justice and beauty and goodness and truth is, namely the philosophers. Right? But that was the allegory of the cave. And it was presented as, remember, what the prisoners saw was the image of a fire on a wall, on the wall of a cave. And they thought that they were seeing the fire because that's all they ever looked at, whereas it was just the image of a fire. And the fire itself was only a representation of the sun, and so forth. So Plato says that to be a true philosopher, you need to look at reality directly, in the way that the philosophers do with the eyes of the mind, not with the eyes of the imagination, and so forth, and all that. I think Tennyson is playing on that here in The Lady of Shalott. So just bear that in mind as you read this. And on the one hand, the problems of being deceived by art, because Plato has brought that to our attention, the problems of being deceived by art. On the other hand, what happens if we dispense with myth and legend and story and just trust science to give us a proper understanding of the world around us? If we get rid of all of the stories that bind our culture together, we get rid of scripture, we get rid of myth, we get rid of legend, we get rid of stories, and if we just see reality through directly with our eyes, what will be left? Will the world be a better place? That seems to be part of this poem as well. So let me read the poem. On either side, the river lie, long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky. And through the field that the road runs by, to many towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round an island there below, the island of Shalott. Willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver, through the wave that runs forever, by the island in the river, flowing down to Camelot. 4 grey walls and 4 grey towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott. By the margin, willow veiled, slide the heavy barges trailed by slow horses, and unhailed the shallop flitteth, silken sailed, skimming down to Camelot. But who hath seen her wave her hand, or at the casement, it's the window, seen her stand? Or is she known in all the land, the Lady of Shalott? Only reapers, reaping early in among the bearded barley, hear a song that echoes cheerly from the river winding clearly down to towered Camelot. And by the moon the reaper weary, piling sheaves in uplands airy, listening whispers, 'tis the fairy Lady of Shalott. Ends part 1. The only people that hear of the Lady of Shalott are the peasants, the people that are uneducated, the people that work close to the soil. The people in the cities have never heard of her. She's a legend to them, but these people are closer to nature, and they still hear her. Part 1. Part 2. There she weaves by night and day a magic web with colors gay. She has heard a whisper say, a curse is on her if she stay to look down to Camelot. She knows not what that curse may be, and so she weaveth steadily, and little other care hath she, the Lady of Shalott. And moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear. There she sees the highway near, winding down to Camelot. There the river eddy whirls, and there the surly village churls, and the red cloaks of market girls pass onward from Shalott. Sometimes a troop of damsels glad, an abbot on an ambling pad, sometimes a curly shepherd lad, or long-haired page in crimson clad, goes down to towered Camelot. And sometimes through the mirror blue, the knights come riding, 2 and 2. She hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott. But in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights, for often through the silent nights a funeral with plumes and lights and music went to Camelot. Or when the moon was overhead, came 2 young lovers lately wed. I am half sick of shadows, said the Lady of Shalott. Part 3. Note that the repetition, and yet within that, there's a transformation within the character. A bow shot from her bower eaves. He rode between the barley sheaves. The sun came dazzling through the leaves and flamed upon the brazen greaves of bold Sir Lancelot. A red cross knight forever kneeled to a lady in his shield that sparkled on the yellow field beside remote Shalott. The gemmy bridle glittered free like to some branch of stars we see hung in the golden galaxy. The bridle bells rang merrily as he rode down to Camelot. And from his blazoned baldric slung a mighty silver bugle hung, and as he rode, his armor rung beside remote Shalott. All in the blue unclouded weather, thick jeweled shone the saddle leather, the helmet and the helmet feather, burned like one burning flame together as he rode down to Camelot. As often through the purple night, below the starry clusters bright, some bearded meteor trailing light moves over still Shalott. His broad clear brow in sunlight glowed, on burnished hooves his war horse trode, for underneath his helmet flowed his coal black curls as he rode down to Camelot. From the bank and from the river, he flashed into the crystal mirror. Tira Lira, by the river, sang Sir Lancelot. She left the web, she left the loom, she made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom, she saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse is come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott. In the stormy east wind straining, the pale yellow woods were waning, the broad stream in his banks complaining, heavily the low sky raining overtowered Camelot. Down she came and found a boat beneath a willow left afloat, and round about the prow she wrote the Lady of Shalott. And down the river's dim expanse, like some bold seer in a trance, seeing all his own mischance, with a glassy countenance, she did look to Camelot. And at the closing of the day, she loosed the chain, and down she lay. The broad stream bore her far away, the Lady of Shalott. Lying robed in snowy white, that loosely flew to left and right, the leaves upon her falling light, through the noises of the night, she floated down to Camelot. And as the boat had wound along the willowy hills and fields among, they heard her singing her last song, the Lady of Shalott. Heard a carol, mournful, holy, chanted loudly, chanted lowly, till her blood was frozen slowly, and her eyes were darkened, wholly, turned to towered Camelot. For ere she reached upon the tide, the first house by the water side, singing in her song, she died, the Lady of Shalott. Under tower and balcony, by garden wall and gallery, a gleaming shape she floated by, dead pale between the houses high, silent unto Camelot. Out upon the wharfs they came, knight and burgher, lord and dame, and round the prow they read her name, the Lady of Shalott. Who is this, and what is here? And in the lighted palace near died the sound of royal cheer, and they crossed themselves for fear, all the knights at Camelot. But Lancelot mused a little space. He said, she has a lovely face. God in his mercy lend her grace, the Lady of Shalott. So, what do we notice about this poem? Let me shrink it down so I can see multiple verses at once. If you're looking at the structure of the poem, some of the common features. What do you notice about the poem? Yes. It's 9. They're 9-line stanzas. Very good. So we get a consistency of rhyme, but also this polarity between Camelot and Shalott. Consistent. Now remember, for the British of the 19th century, Camelot is itself an imaginary place. They're not sure, did King Arthur ever live? We hear in legends that they're King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, but where did they live? And was this a historical person, or was this a legend? And if it was a legend, why was it created? A lot of search for and at the same time as there's the quest for the historical Jesus, there's the quest for the historical Arthur. King Arthur is a part of British legend, the most important figure in British legend. King Arthur, Merlin, the Knights of the Round Table, etc. Was there actually such a man? So Camelot represents in some ways what Shalott represents in this story. It's a place of legend. But you're right. And so lie, rise, sky, all rhyme and by. First 4 lines rhyme, and so do and then we have Camelot and its counterpart Shalott, and then we have 3 other lines which also rhyme, go, blow, and below. And that same pattern holds throughout the entire poem. So it has a regularity about it and rhyme, which gives it an enchanted sense, just like nursery rhyme does. Just the structure of the poem, the repetition, the rhyme, lends to it a sense of, dare I say, magic. It's unreal or artificial. It's conspicuous artifice. It plays upon us and it leaves us with a sense of, we're not just being told a narrative. There's something more going on here. So yes, Camelot and Shalott, but it doesn't, actually, it's not true that it stays Camelot and Shalott. Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott. Okay, first, part 1, it does. Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott. Parts 1 and 2, it does. Suddenly, dun, 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 Camelot is no longer there. In its place is Sir Lancelot. Shalott's still there, but Sir Lancelot comes in the place of Camelot. And what he is a man. And the Lady of Shalott is up in a tower watching through her mirror men and women being married, courting one another in love, and she is sick of living in this little tower where there's no life going on around her. And the reason she does do that is because she's afraid. She's heard a whisper say that if she turns and looks out the window, she will be cursed. But her desires for a man, like these others that she sees in her mirror, are so strong that it pushes her to go against her own fears. And in the process of this, and what's interesting about him, and this is one of the really interesting things in the poem, Sir Lancelot himself looks down forever to a lady in his shield. Now remember Sir Gawain on the inside of his shield. Remember Sir Gawain the Green Knight? He had the shield with the pentangle on it. Yes. But what was on the inside of the shield? Do you recall? Mary, Blessed Virgin Mary. That's right. So whenever he was under severe duress, remember Sir Gawain the Green Knight was about knightly virtue. And he represented in his person knightly virtue. And his access to virtue when he was most sorely pressed. Remember, he was pressed particularly on his sexual chastity by the lady. What would be encouraged for him by the Blessed Virgin Mary. So when he was really tempted and couldn't handle manage his own lusts, he would look to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Same with Sir Lancelot. He's devoted to nothing but duty, to virtue. He's not to be married. And he looks and he kneels to a lady in his shield. So in other words, Sir Lancelot is to that degree, like the Lady of Shalott, who also looks at reality through an image. Not directly. He's not looking at other ladies. He's looking at the lady in the shield, who represents an ideal form of virtue. Right? So he comes along, Sir Lancelot, and he kneels to a lady in his shield. And then we go back to Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott, Camelot, Shalott. And then Camelot, and once again, Sir Lancelot wrecks it. Camelot, Sir Lancelot. So he's broken up the polarity twice. One when he represents Camelot, and the second time when he's getting even closer, and now he is in Shalott. And by in Shalott, he doesn't enter into the tower, he enters into her head. At first, she sees him. Rather than the ideal of Camelot, she sees an actual man that represents that virtue, a virtuous man. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be married to a virtuous man? Having thought about that long enough, she decides to break with her captivity to this image that she sees in the mirror and turns away from it and left the web, left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily room. She saw the helmet in the plume. She looked down to Camelot, and at that point, this whole thing comes apart. And she herself pronounces the curses come upon her. Okay, I want to introduce one more thing here. I talked about the allegory of the cave, which we got from Plato last semester. I also want you to recall that the idea of creating forget that one, and forget that one. This one, weaving a textile like this is something that Penelope did in the Odyssey. And why did she weave? Remember, she was weaving a shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes, who was going to die. Remember, she told the suitors, as soon as I finish this, I'll marry one of you. And during the day, she would do this and beaver away weaving it, and at night she would unravel it. And that went on for 3 years, and they didn't even figure it out. So, as I say, the wine was very good, and they weren't that keen, or I have no idea. But she managed to deceive them for 3 years. And that idea of using art to deceive is part of the Western tradition in many ways as well. The potential deceitfulness of art. And so much so that the word for web in Latin is textum, from which we get text. And something of this has to do with how texts are made in those days. You take threads and you weave them together so that you get a papyrus, something like that. So over strands of this create a text. We use the word text all the time now. It comes from a web. But webs are connected with deceit. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So story making and storytelling is not necessarily truth-telling. It can also be connected with deceiving others. And I think Tennyson is drawing that into our awareness as part of this story as well, that she has believed in the story that she has been told thus far. and it's kept her safe, but it's also kept her from experiencing life. In the same way, Great Britain has held to the story of Christianity throughout its entire existence, at least since the time Christianity was brought to British shores in the 5th century, 6th century, throughout those eras, when Britain was evangelized from Ireland. It's held to the truth of Christianity, and it's been built into the whole fabric of its society, in its laws, in its understandings of freedom, its understanding of communal life and virtue and local governance and all of that. That's part of the British identity. It's the story that binds the nation and gives it meaning and purpose. All of its life is orientated towards that. What happens if you say that that's just a story and the biblical text is just a text? And a text is a web, and webs deceive, and they don't tell the truth. What if you dispense with the text and look at things directly through scientific lenses and dispense with the whole story? What happens? Well, this is what happens. Or is it? This is a complicated story, but again, Tennyson is writing, as I said to you, as at best an agnostic who can't be certain. He knows the importance of the story of Christianity. The whole Victorian era knows the importance of this. And yet, because of modern science, they have been brought to severe doubt so that they don't think that they can hold on to that. And yet, if they hold to the story of Darwinian evolution and different views of the age of the earth and the nature of science, of reality seen through the eyes of modern science, what will that do to them? Will embracing reality actually help them, or will it destroy them? I think that's woven into the text here. By the way, Tennyson is not answering the question. He's just posing the question. At any rate, the lady goes from believing that she's cursed. By the way, where she heard the voice tell her that she's cursed. And then when she turns and the web flies out and the mirror cracks, she concludes that the curse has come upon her. Why does she conclude that? Why does it have to be a curse? According to Plato's rendering, what happens when the prisoners in the cave move from looking at the shadows on the wall and turn their gaze towards the light and walk towards the sunlight, they're emancipated from fraudulent views of the life, and they live happier, more just, good, beautiful, true lives. Life gets better when they dispense with their fictions. That's not what happens here. So if Tennyson really just wanted to say we need to get away from the fictions of the past because they weren't true, he would present this as a liberation moment for the Lady of Shalott. She would go out and marry Sir Lancelot. But that's not what she concludes. She concludes that she's cursed for having done what she was heard in a whisper she should not do. And she lies down, writes her name on the boat, lies down in the boat, and then dies, and the boat drifts down to Camelot, and then they see her for the first time. Remember, they don't even know that she exists. It was only the people in the fields that saw her, the peasants, people, the enlightened people in the city never knew who she was. Only when she's dead. So anyway, comment or question? Yes, sir.
You're talking about why she doesn't feel free. You were also talking about Plato's allegory of the cave. Well, would it be because then sort of live in that captivity of I don't understand reality in its fullness because it's too overwhelming, so therefore I prefer to be a slave and keep looking at shadows instead of looking at the reality as it is.
Yeah, so one of the explanations for how she responds to it might be that she just couldn't cope with reality. And she thought she wanted that, but once she turned away from it, she found she couldn't live in the city. It's like coming from the countryside, growing up on humble circumstances, going to the city and finding this place is very different from where I came from, and I can't survive here. It doesn't operate the way I'm used to. And so she just shrivels up and dies. But that's the story of the Lady of Shalott. Is Tennyson suggesting, therefore, that we should just stick with the old myths? It's more complicated than that. Because Shalott and Camelot are counterparts. Remember, again, I say to you that from the perspective of Great Britain, Camelot is itself a legendary place. Do we really want to hold on to the legend of British virtue represented in the idyllic golden age of the Knights of the Round Table? Do we really want to believe in that national myth? Or should we just dispense with it? And if we dispense with it, what are we left with? Are you better off holding on to something that has some sort of truth? He's asking questions rather than answering them, and I'm not going to solve the riddle of the Lady of Shalott because I don't think the riddle can be solved. I know people have tried to in writing essays for me on it, and you may do that as well. By the way, the essay topics are on the website now. The next essay. Do you have a comment or question?
I was initially going to ask you a question about this, but then I looked up when these things happened, and I don't think that modernist thinking had started when this poem was written.
So when was this poem first written?
1842, according to...
Yeah, so it's written in 1833 first, and then altered in 1842. Okay. Yeah, so it's got nothing to do with Darwin.
Too early for modernist thinking then?
No, there's modernist thinking, there's just not Darwin.
Okay. Because I was going to ask if maybe part of this idea that he has of her looking at reality and then, oh no, I'm cursed, is this reaction to this modernist thinking of science is going to solve all of our problems, and he's going, hang on a second, this is a curse, not the solution that you think it is.
What Tennyson's depicting here, in many ways, is a tension that is observed in European culture from the late 17th century onwards. It's the battle between the ancients and the moderns. What's the better way of who had a better life, the ancients and the way they lived, or are the moderns greater than the ancients? On the side of the moderns tends to be the scientific advancements. That's the biggest argument for the superiority of the modern world to the ancient world is technological advancements. Discoveries of modern science, microscope, telescope, we can see things that weren't seen before. There's all sorts of antibiotics that extend life. We know how to preserve food. We know about illnesses, so that tends to be the case for the moderns. What's the case for the benefit of the ancients? They didn't have the scientific knowledge that we do. However, they have a full understanding of the virtuous life, it seems. And they have great art. And they have, in terms not just of poetry, but even in terms of architecture, buildings that are there for millennia to this day. And we don't build things that last for very long at all. There's no permanence to modern life, other than we think that our physical lives are healthier, etc. our social life seems to have been abandoned by and large to whatever the latest fashions are. And there's no order, there's no permanence from one generation to the next. We don't sing the same songs, we don't listen to the same music. My daughter can't stand my music, I can't stand her music. And it would have been the same in my generation. The music that is created is a generational divider. It happens in churches as well. There's no common songs that are sung, no thoughts that are held in common. And so there's a breaking up, a dissolution, and yet we think that it's superior. What's the standard of superiority then? I mean, it could be superior, could be inferior, but how would we know? What would be the measure that we'd use to determine that? This is the Lady of Shalott is a lady that embraces reality directly and dies for it. But does she die for it because to go outside is to die, or because she accepts she's not emancipated her mind from the problem of being in the tower? Because that was the suggestion that was made. Yeah, she stopped looking at the shadows on the wall, but she still has in her mind that that's reality. And so it kills her. She can't live. Psychologically, she's been damaged by this. Even if I'm not looking at the mirror anymore. Yes, but I still think that the mirror and what it held was true because I lived in that reality long enough and I can't live in this reality. So what Tennyson does, and this is very interesting, and this is a very much of a 19th century phenomenon, is introduces the interest of psychology, increasingly as well. Began in the Romantics, without a doubt. Focus on the imagination. To some degree, she dies because of her own imagination. Yes? She doesn't know the distinction. What's really interesting is in the Romantics, the imagination is only ever good. Imagination does wonderful things. It allows us to see the world with new eyes, whatever. In earlier ages, they had two senses of the imagination. Like Shakespeare has two distinct senses, and Shakespeare reflects the whole tradition in thinking imagination can be used to great harm. It leads people to madness. Or it can be used to give a clearer vision of reality than that which you would get without any imagination. In the post-Romantic era, the imagination is only ever good. I think that Shakespeare and the whole European tradition is more correct in saying that there's some uses of the imagination that are productive and healthy and others that are entirely destructive. So if somebody has lost their mind, we would say, and they say, people are watching me. Don't you see them? Like their eyes up there, like they're in the lights. Everything if I think that there are people watching me in the lights, which probably can be these days, to be fair, that's not that far off. So the screen can certainly be watching me, people looking through the screen. But at one point, that would be a crazy postulate that the lights are actually watching you. But if you think that the government has a capacity to surveil you at all times, then the light bulb could be it, or it could just be something else, or the bush, whatever. That's crazy. But if granted that people wanted to see you and surveil you and the technology existed for it, it's not that crazy to imagine that it is so, even if nobody else thinks it. The reason that we would say that that person was crazy is because they were imagining something that wasn't real. That is exactly the words we would use. They're imagining something that's not real. Okay, so that is a diseased use of the imagination. On the other hand, is every use of the imagination fraudulent, deceptive, harmful? And the answer is no. Some stories have the opposite effect. And I think that's what Tennyson is concerned with, is that all stories are being jettisoned because they are textual and they're telling stories, and some stories, he thinks, have truth in them that needs to be preserved. In a sense, the story is against simplistic views of story Science does not tell us everything we need to know about life. It can't teach us anything about virtue. And there's no virtue, then life is brutal. And I can tell you from the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries that one of the most horrid developments is they think that ethics as a discipline is the objectivity of morality. There is no such thing. They think morality is a subjective thing. So good and evil, those are just subjective things. You say it's good, I say it's evil. The difference, well, that's your perspective, this is mine. Nobody in the ancient world would ever have held that. Nobody until the 18th century would have held that opinion. They all believe in what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, which is the objective nature of right and wrong, across every culture, every major religion, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Confucian, Buddhist, like no matter what you have, they have a sense there's a right and there's a wrong. And you live in accordance with that. And it's an absolute, uncompromising, there is no, we will punish you if you go against this because it's wrong. That goes away. And science is largely used as the means of eradicating it. So I think it's a bit about that as well. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater, we would tend to say. Okay, I think I'm done with any comments or questions before we conclude. Who likes Tennyson? Good, I love Tennyson. He's really good. And as I say, I don't understand why he's not read more, other than the terrible reason that I said we're just unwilling to entertain colonialist writers, even though I don't think Tennyson's anything like a colonialist, but he's in that era. Anyway, okay, we're done for today. I'll see you next class.